I'm sure many of you have been to a newly remodeled McDonald's, possibly one with the McCafe. But have you ever looked up why they started remodeling the restaurants in the first place? The first McCafe in the States popped up in Chicago back in May of 2001. That was just the beginning. Now, over the last 5 years, McDonald's has taken to remodeling every single restaurant in America. Most of you might even be asking yourselves how long it's been since you've last stepped foot in an old McDonald's. Ask anyone who's done some market research and you'll hear something strange. McDonald's loses money from this process. That's a fact. The new furniture isn't pulling in new customers, and the McCafes can't sell coffee that's cheap and in turn a profit. Look at Starbucks' prices and you'll see what I mean. Stakeholders say they wanted a more adult vibe for the restaurant, a quote-unquote classier look for a classier America. Wrong answer. Google it right now. What's McDonald's target age group? It's children and teens. It always has been, and always will be. So, then why did they start all these remodels? Why would one of the largest corporations in America spend over $1 billion on a terrible marketing strategy? That's when things get interesting. Let's start with the play places. If you can't remember, almost no two play places at McDonald's were identical. Some of them were really fun. I know I had a personal few favorites. Well, some of them are also very dangerous. The first gem I could find was a carousel play place in Lancaster, Pennsylvania back in the 1980s that got shut down mere months after opening. Little information was given about why they had closed down. The lot, to this very day, has been vacant. If you find the right connections in Lancaster, though, you just might be able to read an article that didn't manage to make it into print. Children would play on the merry-go-round in ways they weren't supposed to, you see. They're kids, so of course they would do that. Well, one day, a few kids managed to crawl underneath the thing, and then they never made it back out. The whole incident was so heavily guarded by McDonald's PR, you'd be troubled to find a single person that was even there that whole afternoon. However, one witness did have one interesting anecdote to say about the whole situation. When they went under, a few parents started calling for help. Then something happened to the lights. The carousel just kept getting brighter and brighter, and the music was deafening. I ran out of the building when the machines started to smoke, but I looked back through the window to see if the kids were alright, and the employees were just standing there behind the registers, doing absolutely nothing to stop the situation. They looked like they were only waiting for more customers to come in. Weirder and weirder stories began to pick up throughout the years. Reports of children sinking into ball pits that should only have been a foot deep. Mothers searching play tubes for their children, only to find nothing left but a lonely pair of shoes. But the play places held a more fraction of the incidents. Back in 1996 in Knoxville, Tennessee, there was a businessman in his 40s who went into a McDonald's restroom and remained there for 7 whole hours. Patrons noted that he refused to leave the furthest back stall. The police were finally called, and they managed to break down the door. He was restrained by paramedics as he wouldn't willingly leave the restroom. As they pulled out of the small stall, he began screaming bloody murder. "Take me back! I want to go back!" But the moment he exited the restaurant, he passed out. To this very day, he has absolutely no memory of even entering a McDonald's the day of the incident. The restaurant was shut down before anyone could inspect the stall he had shut himself in. However, anyone who used the restroom that day mentioned hearing several voices whispering things like, "It wasn't him. We have to go back. So smile." Then there was a fry cook somewhere in Vermont back in 1999 who walked in the middle of the restaurant and dumped scalding oil on himself without flinching or saying a word. Several of the customers started to laugh and roll around in the burning oil alongside him, and all were rushed to the hospital. Only one survived, but refused to even make a statement. Not like she would have been able to anyway. Her throat melted all the way through and had to be completely restructured. The manager claimed he didn't remember even hiring a fry cook, and that he wasn't in any official paperwork. His name tag didn't even have a name, just 4 pound signs written on it. Once again, the McDonald's was closed without a trace. Most of these stories sounded like urban legends to me, but it never failed. Whenever I found a story, a McDonald's had been shut down in its wake. Near the late 2000s, the number of cover-ups had become so frequent that McDonald's decided to shut every single one of them down and rebuild them. Every single one of them. But of course, they'd miss a few. I needed to see one for myself. I remember going into the old McDonald's as a kid, but that was before the frequency of the incidents. That was when it was still safe. There was a small town on the way to my parents' house just off of the highway. Oroska was its name. Maybe about 100 residents in total. Completely untouched by the outside world. Nearly practically forgotten in the process. It was pointless to stop there for any normal reasons because there wasn't a gas station or rest stop anywhere near it. Not even a sign to really let you know that you were close. Let's just say I had to sneak my way around some very old building permits to discover that they had one of the last few McDonald's, aside for some treasured landmarks, that had yet to go through a remodel since the 1970s. How lucky is that? I was surprised that they even had a fast food place there, yet they didn't even really have so much as a market or a post office. Rather odd if you ask me. I planned a trip at my parents' place for the weekend, with a stop of Oroska around the way. It was already dark out since it was the dead of winter, and I didn't get off work till around 5. I was cold and kind of pissed off about driving at night, but extremely determined. I don't think I ever would have found the place before phone GPS. The turnoff from the highway was just a dirt road with no landmarks or anything. As I pulled into town, none of the houses had lights on. Most of the street lights were out as well, as though nobody had remembered to change the bulbs in years. This place really was untouched. I'd be surprised if most of the residents hadn't moved out or simply died off at this point. It definitely had the markings of a ghost town anyway. I was about to lose hope when I finally saw it. The nauseous yellow lights of those golden arches illuminating a vacant parking lot in the distance. It buzzed and flickered like a fly zapper running out of batteries. The sign below said, "Eat new egg McUffin. We like to saw you smile." Which I assume was just a lazy teen's handiwork. I pulled into the lot and carelessly parked my car in the center of the place. There was nobody there anyway. When I stepped out of my car, I felt a squish underneath my foot. There was a burger covered in mold with a rancid liquid oozing out. The smell was absolutely vomit-worthy. I jumped out and began to scrape the remaining contents off of the back of my shoe. It was pretty damn disgusting, to say the least. And that's when I had noticed that the parking lot was covered in trash. There were half-eaten boxes of fries and sun-baked children's toys spilling out of old greased-up McDonald's bags. Everything was mixed in with the dirt and snow like it had been there for months, possibly years. I hurried across the lot to avoid retching all over the asphalt. As I approached the door, I noticed the windows were caked in dust. Somebody had taped a piece of paper to the door with the words "closed" scribbled across it in red marker, yet the sign hung from the inside clearly said "open." Cautiously, I approached the door and pushed. An artificial bell hummed, an old McDonald's tune that fizzled out on the last few notes as the door creaked open. I looked around the fluorescent-lit room and I saw it was void of life. There was nobody sitting at any of the tables and nobody attending the registers. Somebody had left a tray on one of the tables in the back, but there was no other sign someone had been here. The inside was at least a little bit cleaner. The toys on display by the counter were of characters I had never even heard of, likely from before my time. The whole place was covered in faded coats of yellow and red paint, and all the tables had that classic McDonald's wood finish. Although the wood looked completely rotten, though, slathered in coats of polish in a sad attempt to keep it looking new. All of it had a sort of a green hue, which I contributed to the old lights. The most noticeable element, though, was a terrible burning plastic smell that stung my nose. I went up to the register. I felt like I shouldn't order anything, but I was hoping maybe I could possibly ask a few questions. I waited for a good 15 minutes in silence. I shouted hello with only a muted echo for a response. I had been to a few McDonald's with bad service in the past, but this was insane. With how dirty the whole place was, I should have expected as much. Just as I was about to turn around and give up, the cash register suddenly popped open. It was practically begging me to take a tip for myself. Besides, didn't I deserve a slight reward for wasting my time here? I casually walked over to it and saw at least a dozen 20s stacked high. Looking around to make sure nobody was watching me, I reached in to take a few bills when the thing suddenly snapped closed right under my fingers. The metal dug deep into my flesh, leaving a dark trail of blood down the side of the counters. I wound up yelling out in pain. Behind the counter on the other end of the grill was a first aid kit hanging on the wall. The lights were burning out in the kitchen area, but I needed a bandage pronto. I hopped over to the table and made my way to the back. The burning smell was getting stronger as I walked. I noticed the grill was covered in a thick layer of grease, completely unsuitable for cooking. I passed by the frying station and the oil was filled to the top with writhing, disgusting vermin infested maggots. I quickened my walk to the first aid kit, hoping to get patched up and out of there as soon as possible. I was starting to realize that this restaurant definitely wasn't open for business anymore, and I probably shouldn't have entered it in the first place. I opened up the first aid kit and had to swallow some vomit. A cloud of mold burst out from it in every direction, followed by the same bubbling black ooze that was on the burger outside. I started coughing and waving my hands in the air to clear the mold dust floating around. The same bell I had heard playing that McDonald's tune started up again as I steadied myself. I assumed it was broken like the rest of the dump. I looked back towards the counter and noticed everything seemed farther away. I must have been disoriented from losing blood and that awful plastic smell. I looked down at my hands to see how bad the wound was and my eyes widened. There was no wound on either of my hands at all. I rushed back towards the counter in a panic when something under the stove caught my foot and I fell. In the darkness, my eyes started to adjust and I saw the outline of a body. Somebody was under there. Maybe they were unconscious and needed help. I yanked the person's arm and a half-decayed body slid out across the floor. They were wearing a McDonald's employee shirt and a name tag with 4 pounds was on there. Their mouth was contorted into a sickening grin, but their eyes were screaming. I tried to shout, but no sound came out, like trying to wake up from a nightmare. I scrambled to get back up on the counter, and the lights started to dim and the McDonald's tune was getting louder and louder, the notes fizzling and distorting every time it played. Once I had gotten my grip above the counter, I froze. Since entering, I never looked at the side of the restaurant opposite the counter. There was a play place there. The glass separating the main restaurant from the play area had hundreds of bloody handprints smeared towards the floor. The tube slide was caved in with chunks of red liquid spurting out of the tiny hole left at the bottom. There was a row of nooses tied to the monkey bars and the counter with employees wearing the same tags, name tags hanging from them. The tables around the perimeter had skeletons with rotting food left on trays. some of the food hanging from the skulls' mouths. I looked on in horror, too shocked to even move. While the rest of the restaurant went dark, a bulb in the center of the playplace continued to glow like a carnival spotlight. Below it was a massive ball pit, barely able to contain all of its colorful plastic balls. It was smoking under the blaring white light, making that awful burning plastic smell. The balls began to rattle and fall off the edge when something inside started shuffling around. I wanted to run so badly. I wanted to run so badly, but my body refused. Then suddenly the music went dead, and the movement stopped. A yellow glove slowly crept upward from the pit below, writhing its fingers as it went. A connected red and white sleeve came after it, slowly but surely alternating colors as they appeared from underneath. The arm continued to reach towards the sky, growing more and more while its joints popped and cracked like breaking branches. By the end, that arm had to have been at least 6 feet long. It finally reached the lit light bulb on the ceiling with its mangled, gloved fingers and began to slowly and tortuously twist it loose. I broke into a sprint, jumping over the counter and toppling chairs as I went. The last light went out, and just as I got to the exit, I bashed through the door, breaking the glass in the process. As I rolled into the parking lot in pain, I heard a distant scream, and then something whispered right in my ear. In dead silence. It had the same tinny distortion as the McDonald's tune. Come back. I want to see you smile. I haven't told anybody about what happened there that night. There was an article online saying Oroska burned down to the ground a few days later. I don't know if it was a cover-up or not, but I'm not going back to find out. I didn't share this because I want you to get involved, by the way. I shared it to warn you about what happens when you do. You can go to your new McDonald's, keep getting your Big Macs, keep getting your McCafe coffee, that's perfectly fine. They did something to the remodels to make them safe. Or, at least for now. But for the love of God, do not enter into an old McDonald's. Under no circumstance are you to ever go into those places. No matter what, not even through the drive-thru, do not be willing to take the risk that I did. It isn't working. I've got to stop typing now. I need to go to the counter and get some medication. Pain meds specifically. My jaw hurts like hell, and the hand I snapped in that register hasn't stopped itching. Well, my little shadows, this story was a perfect example of the phrase, well, that was anticlimactic. I'm really not too surprised about that, though, given how the second half of the story was about as bad as your typical movie in the $5 DVD bin at Walmart. I mean, sure, you start off with some pretty promising concepts and pretty good movies at the very start of the pile, only as you continue to dive further and further and further into the pile itself, only to particularly have your dreams about finding that special movie of yours completely crushed and your melons deflated when you start to rummage around that god-awful bottom of the barrel section. Or in this case, bin, I guess. And this story was exactly that. A giant Walmart bin that started off promising, but then in the end just quite literally was nothing more but a pure bundle of crap. To start off this review, this creepypasta had a relatively good startup and a hook at the very beginning of the story, which I very much enjoyed. I mean, even with the protagonist going into a question that I'm honestly quite sure that is ran throughout our minds at least one time, anytime of us have went by a fast food restaurant. A little personal story before I actually continue with this review. I remember when the McDonald's, the Wendy's, the Burger Kings, all of those places pretty much all looked the same. Well, not the same. They all look different. You know, they all had their own specific kind of branding to them. I mean, I think the last place that I remember a McDonald's actually looking like a McDonald's and not a giant square was when they sat there, like, I think it was at least a couple of, like, 2 years back, I think, actually, now that I think about it. I mean, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what it was. It was pretty much just an entire, you know, you knew exactly what the McDonald's was. I mean, you could tell primarily by the building. But when they started sitting there and actually modernizing the whole thing by sitting there and changing them into this giant, ungodly square shape, it just completely killed everything about the place. But the one thing I will go out of my way and say that the story kind of more or less fails to acknowledge, now maybe this is because of the fact that the story itself was written at the time that this was just starting, but if McDonald's was the one that was doing this, then why is it that the other corporations like Wendy's, Burger King, Taco Bell, any and all those places that were doing that as well? It kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense because, you know, if McDonald's is doing this primarily because of the fact that there's some dark hidden secret, does that mean it's the same way with the other restaurants? I mean, that's kind of something that I really felt that the story really could have incorporated, or at least made a sequel, dealing with this. I mean, a sequel to the story really could explain a whole lot, but unfortunately, it's unlikely that we're ever going to get one of these from the official writer. Now, continuing on with the actual review of itself, I mean, the premise alone is very good. It's enough to sit there and come up with a relatively great storyline. And, you know, given how this creepypasta goes all out with the various stories, news articles, and all that, you know, it starts off relatively well, because it makes you wonder, you know, what in the world's going on? It really kind of helps fuel that little bit of that single question as to why exactly the McDonald's changed as much as they did. But, and hell, I'm even willing to excuse the whole 4 pound situation here. But like I said, you know, there was so much to the story that really could have been a whole lot more enjoyable. I mean, especially with the whole, you know, going stories news-wise and everything. Oh yeah, that's right. The whole pound situation and everything. I didn't mind that too much, you know, because it kind of adds a little bit of an extra bit of mystery to the whole story itself. Like, what the hell does the whole pound sign symbol even mean? You know, it really could have been expanded on a little bit more, but sadly though, it doesn't do that. I mean, to be completely honest, if the investigations and everything that went throughout this pasta actually had stayed the way that it did, this story would have actually been a very great one. Unfortunately, though, that just isn't the case. I mean, don't get me wrong, first half of the story dealt with the topics that were pretty dang enjoyable on their own. But unfortunately, like the Walmart bin of DVDs of despair, things got terrible real quickly. I'm not joking. This story started off in a very realistic manner, but and I'm not kidding here. When I actually started really looking into the story for like the second time around, I know I've narrated the story a few times, especially on my old channel, but this was something I never really honestly looked into. You see, the biggest issue I have with the story itself is that it kind of switched from this whole, you know, news article perspective that it was actually interesting to the actual protagonist kind of going into his own perspective. Now, I don't have a problem with this. I don't have a major problem whatsoever with people doing this in their stories. In fact, I actually think it's a good thing to sit there and kind of switch perspectives every so often to kind of give a different, you know, thought on, you know, what's going on, or a different viewpoint. Any of those kind of things could actually be relatively interesting. But again, the story doesn't really do that. It basically just kind of goes along the lines of this person going to Ороska, which is pretty much apparently an old abandoned town. I mean, I don't really even know if that place exists or not. I'll probably have to look it up on Google Maps. But the real issue, however, is that, you know, apparently one of the oldest McDonald's still around. I mean, don't get me wrong. The idea of it, you know, okay, fine. You know, going to an abandoned place, that's not the issue here. That really isn't the issue. The real issue, however, is the fact that it kind of has this cliche concept of just the ghost town itself. I have no problem with ghost towns being incorporated in creepypastas, like with any story, but To me, it just kind of felt a little bit out of place. Well, not just out of place, but kind of typical as well. I mean, yeah, it's a basically old, dilapidated town that barely has anything except a few houses and a McDonald's. Of course, it's pretty much going to be completely abandoned. I mean, it's something, not only being it completely abandoned, but also more or less just kind of already spoiling the whole spooky atmosphere that the story itself is trying to kind of go into. And boy, oh boy, do we get into the terrible parts when this protagonist actually walks into the actual restaurant itself. Let me just say right now that this story, around the time, immediately when this protagonist walked into that place, we're hit with a spoopy, ghosty story set of cliches that I'm quite sure would make even a children's horror book look relatively decent. And I genuinely mean this, where in the world do I even begin with these cliches? I mean, well, first of all, the protagonist in the story is definitely an idiot. I mean, I've said that before with other stories I've discussed, but why is it that many creepypastas themselves, the protagonist is a complete and utter moron? I mean, honest to God, this person goes into an abandoned town that's pretty much completely desolated. Nothing, or very little, very likely nothing there. Stumbles across an old restaurant practically covered in a bunch of broken toys, moldy food, and just rundown looking everything. Walks into the restaurant itself, and get this, the place is still old and decimated and rotting. And then does the stupidest thing about, oh yeah, I wasn't going to order anything, I was just going to talk. And then sits there and stands there like a moron. Dude, the place even says it's closed. The story even made it abundantly clear that the place itself was not open. There was even that little sign right there, even though it was written on paper, that said that it was closed. I mean, really? Are you either blind or just that dumb? I mean, look, I get it. It's a creepypasta. But people, seriously, how does that not click in your mind? If anything, something like that would be classified as a red flag. I mean, it would be one thing if this individual was going in there to kind of do a little bit of exploration or something. Like, maybe an urban exploring kind of situation would have been a lot more, well, detailed, I guess. I mean, even with the store itself still having electricity or something along those lines would still have been interesting. Unfortunately, like I said before, it doesn't go down that path, because that would actually have made the story great. And then, yeah, it just kind of more or less continues on with that for quite a long time. And then the story basically just kind of goes into a bunch of other various cliches and the like afterwards. I mean, with the person, grabbing the $20 bills, getting his hands stuck in there for whatever reason. I mean, except ghost. Or something along those lines. I mean, I'm willing to give that part a pass, to be completely honest, but then we get into the following cliches that happen afterwards. The opening and closing of the door on its own with the fizzling sound. Then we have the lights flickering on and off, and the walls will ooze green slime. Oh wait, wrong episode, sorry. Basically the kind of typical thing that you'd sit there and you'd hear Squidward sit there and talk about in like freaking Night Shift or something like that. I mean, any and all these things just kind of, they don't provide much of anything. I mean, don't get me wrong, the part with the giant Ronald McDonald hand kind of grasping at the whole, bulb and twisting it slowly was kind of eerie. I will give it that. That is a positive. But everything else, from like hanging dead employees with pound signs on them, spooky, scary skeletons sitting there with rotting food in their mouths, a dead, half-decayed body with a guy with the same pound signs, nooses, blood, handprints, all these things basically say child's horror novel, not creepypasta. This kind of thing I could see scaring like a small kid, not a teenager, not an adult. I mean, the cliches themselves are so old that even cliched creepypastas don't even use something like that. Or even if they do, it's their attempt at trying to make something decent, I guess. I mean, the skeleton ones were actually one that kind of just made me like go, no, I'm done with this. The skeleton part, let me just be honest, was just there because skeletons. Let's be fair. Let's just be frank. And then, of course, we have the protagonist literally running out, and then, as much as I know I'm ragging on the second half of the story, I will say this: the little whisper and everything with the "come back, I'd like to see you smile," that was actually pretty good. I actually really did enjoy that little part right there. It was a small little bit, but it was actually quite enjoyable. The rest of it, however, just kind of fell extremely cliched. That's all I really have to say. I mean, the rest of the story just doesn't really do much except for the protagonist saying, yeah, just go ahead and enjoy whatever it is that you are enjoying or whatever. Like, you know, like just that. And that's kind of... It's a good closing, I guess, but again, it doesn't really do a whole lot. I mean, there's not much else really to say about the story other than that. It had a great startup, but a very, very poor ending. Here, are there any honest potential theories or anything that can kind of explain what really went down at that restaurant? You know, how all this insane kind of things went on? This is actually obviously a part of the video where I try and find these, and I actually did manage to find one of them. Well, one specific theory that I actually do think explains this whole situation, you know, what happened afterwards. Now, if you actually go a bit towards the end of the story, around the time where the protagonist gets his hand slammed into the cash register, you will note that the protagonist immediately runs down, goes and tries to find a first aid kit. However, immediately right after he opens it up, he gets hit with the big thing of old, dusty mold and various other spores and the like that basically fill his face up and completely and utterly cover him. I mean, he breathes this stuff in at least a few times. It's even stated in the story, you know, with him coughing and all of that. Now, think about that for a second. Those are old, disgusting spores and the like going into his body, into his system, and very likely screwing around with his brain. Which, if you think about it, actually explains a good bit about what had happened primarily after that whole situation hand came by. For example, if you go a little bit more deeper afterwards when he throws the thing down, he looks down at his wounds only to see that they were completely gone. Now, it is quite likely, however, that the actual wounds themselves very likely were not completely healed, but it's very likely because of the spores and everything else that went into him that he was hallucinating that everything was fine. And of course, basically running off, trying to get out of there as quickly as possible, only to be tripped down. Which, when he looks at them, he basically hallucinates the body of a specific employee, well, just an employee with the pound signs, basically right then and there, like right there in front of him. Like, but what really could have happened was likely he might have tripped on like a piece of cooking equipment or something that he might not have seen when he walked over there, you know, and basically hallucinated the whole thing. Which really explains a whole lot. I mean, if you think about it, everything that went on with this whole situation, from the ball pits to the play places to the employees to the pound signs, all of these things are things that the protagonist looked into beforehand, and the spores and everything that went into him, basically giving him the hallucinations, are all reflections of what he wound up finding out about the place. Hence the reason why he saw what he saw. From the skeletons to the raw McDonald hand, from the whispering, all of those things themselves are basically coming out in the form of hallucinations. And if you think about it, very likely nothing is actually happening in real life, but to him, all this is going on. So of course, he basically freaks out. He jumps out and breaks the entire thing down, you know, the door specifically, and runs off. Now, it is made a mention after the story that the actual place wound up burning down. Now, this is another little theory, it's a small one, but the very reason I believe that the place was burned down to the ground wasn't so much because of a cover-up, but likely because of the faulty wiring and everything. And if you really look into the story itself, it says that the actual place wound up, kind of losing any kind of light that it had. And very likely what could have happened is that during the whole shenanigans that went on, the protagonist very likely might have tripped on something or just kind of screwed around with something during its escape, and of course ultimately wind up burning the McDonald's down by sparks or something along those lines with the rotted wood. And because of that, the fire just continuously spread, thus potentially wiping the entire place off of the map. That right there is actually something I could say would really explain a lot more and actually really forgive the second half of the story if that was actually incorporated into it. And I think that if you really put this into perspective, it makes a lot of extra sense. Hence the reason why the protagonist is doing the things that he's done, why he put that stuff down. I mean, yes, it's cliched, but at least it's an explanation as to why all of it happened to begin with. Of course, so it's understandable why he would come to the conclusion at the very end. So my final thoughts are this creepypasta. Overall, I think that the story itself wasn't really anything too particularly special. I mean, disregarding the whole theory I just made and everything, the story itself just doesn't really hold up that much, and that's extremely disappointing to me. I mean, so many narrators so far, besides myself and various others, like Mr. Creepypasta and even Creepypasta Jr. and the like, basically every one of them wind up giving the story a full-on narration, which, that's fine, that's their thing, but honestly, with the way that this pasta went out, I don't exactly think that it really should have gotten as much popularity as it did. I mean, yeah. The story, sure enough, it had a great startup, it had a strong storyline at the very beginning, but again, the rest of the story just went down the extreme level of cliche fest. I mean, it was just completely underwhelming, it didn't explain anything, and it was just completely cheap and used for crappy scares, up until around the ending or so. Now, personally, what I would have honestly done for this, had I actually wound up making this story myself, was sit there and actually try and incorporate a more realistic storyline regarding the closing of the McDonald's, or at the very least using the said theory that I had made a mention of earlier, and incorporating that into the story and really kind of going into a little bit more, detail, or the protagonist kind of realizing that and going back and looking at everything. Or it could have gone down something along the lines of an urban exploration kind of deal, with the protagonist attempting to document everything that he sees at the old McDonald's that he walked into, only to particularly find something a lot more disturbing than anything. I mean, even if it is something relatively paranormal, at the very least, it could explain some of the things that went on in the news-related sections. And would explain a lot. I mean, those kind of things really could have helped the story out a lot, but unfortunately, it just doesn't. I mean, and it's extremely unfortunate. My final rating of this creepypasta, in regards to the writing, I give it a 5 out of 10. Pretty decent for what it was the first half, but the second half, flat out, just failed entirely. The character, I give him a 1 out of 10. Let me just be honest. He's a moron. I think we can all agree to that. The atmosphere and the scare factor were pretty good, I will admit, especially around the ending slightly. But I really do think that and definitely the Ronald McDonald clown thing, let me tell you, that's nightmare fuel right there, people. That right there actually was a pretty damn good scare, to some degree. But the rest of it just didn't really do much for me. So, scare-wise, I give it a 3 out of 10. In regards to how the grammar and the storyline, everything, perfect, fine, 10 out of 10, no issues whatsoever with that. That's great. My overall rating, however, the story, I give the story a 4.5 out of 10. It definitely has a lot of good going for it at the very beginning, but the second half really needs a lot of extra work to really make this into a very good creepypasta. But again, like I always say with these videos, this is only my opinion. This is my simple, stupid, personal opinion, and we're all ultimately entitled to our own thoughts in regards to these stories. This is my own one, and I'm entitled to my one just as much as you are entitled to yours. And I would definitely like to hear your own thoughts about this creepypasta. Did you guys enjoy this story? Did you happen to not enjoy it? Were you mixed about it? Any kind of opinion you can give about this story, I'd like to sit there and hear in the comments section below. I want to thank you guys again for watching today's episode. I really hope you all enjoyed it. I ask all of you, if you're brand new here to this channel, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below, because I make brand new videos every Wednesday and Friday. Or at least until I can actually really get to that schedule. Right now, it's kind of mixed up right now, but I will try and make sure of it that I actually manage to get to both of those in due time. But I thank you guys again for watching this video. I will be having a brand new one out very likely today. Thanks again for watching. I'm the Shadow Reader, and like always, roll the outro because I'm out.
In fear and surprise as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping horror-driven nightmarish gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at any day.